We'll continue with a conversation between Cian Dayrit and Timoteus Kusno. If I may have you to the stage. Thank you. Cian Dayrit is an artist based in Manila. His work looks at the issues of power and identity in monuments, museums, maps, and other institutions. And Timoteus Kusno is an artist based in Yogyakarta. He works across installation, film, drawing, and photography, and he uses ethnographic and institutional approaches to look at the coloniality of power. In their conversation, they will share similar artistic methodologies, research questions, and discuss their take on identity, power, and speculation. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Oscar. Well, thanks for having us here. So actually, it's always been so tricky for me to talk about my works, where to start and how to end. So I had prepared this video, and then we can start conversation with Cian. So please enjoy.
Tanah Lujuk is developed from the fragmental memories of my childhood. My family and I moved from Java to several remote places in Sumatra Island. I grew up in a village located between the forest and plantation. Sometimes the misty landscapes still show themselves in my sleep. I can still remember the sound of the foggy waterfall, the silence of the chasm, and my near-death experience of being washed away during a massive rain. I remember seeing my friend's father catching a tiger copycat rat, hearing the story of wild elephants destroying plantation then being shot to death. I remember got chased by the wild boar and saved by my neighbors who spared that poor animal. At the end of the day, we watched the development of Java Island, and our super great President Suharto was smiling, holding a harvest of rice, right before Terminator 2 being aired on my neighbor's TV. That's me on the picture, next to my grandpa. I don't really remember who's the other boy on top of the cannon. The photo was taken in a British fort called Marlborough in Bengkulu. I remember it very clearly. Every year, when we were in Java, my grandpa usually took me to see the military carnival, carrying me on his shoulder, watching the men in uniform, driving stills, shooting the air. I was fascinated and forgot the feeling of longing for my father, who was on his duty in East Timor. He was working as a teacher under a governmental program. Later, I figured out that 1/3 of the population in East Timor were suffered to death by hunger, disease, and violence as the military force occupied the region, under a governmental program as well. A decade after Suharto hunted down the communists and became the supreme leader. As I studied in the Catholic elementary school, I was really into the religion subject, and maybe history too, I'm not sure. As I can recall, everyone had to take history seriously, without any doubt, as it is like a religion subject. There was no other way to see the past but through history that had been arranged carefully by the authority. It was a sin to question history. History was a sacred book. 25 days before the death of Pol Pot, Suharto stepped down from his position as President of Indonesia. Following the collapse of support, as well as massive student protests and chaos in most major cities all across Indonesia. Now, 2 decades after the fall of the regime, 1.5 centuries after Multatuli protested against the Dutch rule for the exploitation of millions of Javanese people, We are still dealing with the wrecks, intertwined with the misty and complex colonial feudal legacies which have been shaping Indonesia today. Sparta's new order regime had succeeded in maintaining the archipelago by replicating the mixture of colonial and feudal formulation of power through language, knowledge, and repressive force. How are these residual transforming in Indonesia's post-dictatorship context with its long colonial experience? As I try to understand more, I initiated Project Center for Tanah Studies in 2013. The idea of this project came from my reflection of growing up and living in the era of rapid transformation in Indonesia, in the age of the dictatorship up to this day. This project appropriates the model of knowledge production and distribution, which are strongly related to the legacies of European colonialism and Japanese occupation, in establishing and performing power, of which I suspect still regenerate in contemporary Indonesia as the new order established during the dictatorship. This fictional study center is an attempt to deconstruct the way we read, perceive, and deal with those mystified leftovers. Growing from the idea of ethnography by using moving and still images, museum and text as representational medium, the Center for Tanah Studies might stand as a fictional institution to question the institutionalized sanctioned ignorance, the interrelating discourse and text which embodied colonial mentality in a subtle gesture. This unsettled narratology is an approach to explore the invisible narratives that had been marginalized by the regime. The regime of thinking embodied in the institutions, with a strong sense of framing, stereotyping, selecting, editing, as I also experienced in the Indonesian post-colonial context, tend to be taken for granted as something fixed. It's just there. As the period of history, colonialism might be over. But at the ideological level, as the system of value and knowledge, it's like a ghost. It's haunting. It's lit in school books, in the museum footprints, in the organized violence, in the implanted way to see the others. How can we talk about something that is considered non-existing, invisible, or left as incomplete pieces, which still remains as a taboo?
There we go. All right, thanks, man, for that. Okay. And thanks for having us. I'm Cian. I'm an artist from Manila, also an activist. I'm going to try to be concise here and try not to ramble too much about this particular project of mine I did in Bataan in 2017, which is also like a continuous work. Basically, to give you a little background, Bataan province is just across Manila Bay from Manila, about 3-4 hours drive from where I live. It's a residency in a place called Bellas Artes. So I can't exactly talk about this project without talking about all the contradictions within this project. Basically, the residency is in a beach resort that has heritage architecture in it. So the owner of this residency is also a real estate developer, and then I guess it started out as a hobby, and then they started collecting heritage property from all over the Philippines, uprooting it and putting it there in the resort, and then they opened it as a resort, which became some sort of like a heritage place. As a little backgrounder, these are maps of Bataan. Bataan is a peninsula, so that little peninsula, like similar to Korea, this is the general region, but then these are samples of maps within the research showing the landscape reduced to like the coastal map, airfields, physiography, vegetation, basically looking at land as resources. So like I said, Bataan is a peninsula province across Manila Bay. It's about 3 to 4 hours from Manila. It's more known as the last stand of Filipino and American soldiers during Japanese occupation of World War II. The captured soldiers were made to walk over 100 kilometers north to concentration camps. Many died in that event, which is known as the Bataan Death March. That was in 1945. Today, Bataan is home to one of the biggest export processing zones in the country, several coal plants, and the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, which is an unfinished, outdated project started by the ousted dictator Ferdinand Marcos, which we are still paying for today, even though we never really benefited from it. With all of these industrial infrastructure catering to global economy, several beach and mountain resorts as well as pedicured residential estates have been developed to cater to foreign investors and other wealthy Filipinos, displacing local peasant populations and pushing the indigenous communities further up into the hinterlands. Basically, I was there in residency for like roughly 8 months, and then since I live just 3 to 4 hours, I would drive back and forth every other week to do research within Manila and within different spots in the Bataan Peninsula. But then I was looking into what is known and mentioned within the broad strokes of mainstream national history. I was interested in the gaps of local history. In the peripheries were stories of peasant and worker revolts and wild uncivilized men with spears. My practice is focused on challenging dominant and privileged perspectives and highlighting underrepresented narratives. There we go. So this is a map of Bataan, and then the 3 on the left are maps of Bataan in the region and the Philippine archipelago, pointing out where the Aita communities are. So basically, the whole research within the residency and then the show that came out after it became like an exhibition that was about the local history and the culture of the Aita communities. So just as a little background, the Aita are the communities, also known as the Negritos, Spanish for small black men, are indigenous peoples retaining primarily hunter-gatherer subsistence to supply basic needs. Aita community generally maintain a distance to more dominant lowland communities and have been largely excluded in development, nation building, and any sort of political representation. Today, most Aita communities in central Luzon are facing state aggression as their lands are militarized and taken from them. Entire mountain ranges are flattened to make way for new cities that will supposedly decongest the dense urban wasteland that is Manila and supposedly generate thousands of new jobs. But then at the same time, 20,000 Aita families will be displaced and barely anyone is talking about it. This is currently happening now within regions around Central Luzon, which Bataan is also included. They are, as always, excluded from the planning. So I'm basically showing you some of the research to start, and then later on a little bit of the methodology of the research and like how I sort of got into thinking about these. So IPs, indigenous peoples, but then since we're all indigenous one way or another in the Philippines, I guess we're actually referring to national minorities or ethno-linguistic minorities. They have barely any access to social services like healthcare and education, not because they live in the deep countryside, but because their ancestral lands are attractive to multinational corporations for mineral extraction or cash crop plantations. These corporations plunder the ecological balance and exploit peasant and indigenous populations. also affected are the country's food security and sovereignty as neoliberal policies support the large-scale corporate land grabs and continuously dispossess marginalized sectors. So basically, like, I started looking into this barely talked about aspect of the local history of the Bataan province. There was very little to no, very limited material written about the local history and culture of the indigenous communities there or any other aitas within the archipelago. So I started collecting whatever I could find from different archives in Manila, in Bataan, and online basically. And I sort of stumbled upon like a handful of contemporary researchers, like current, like very recent published journals and articles. And then I sort of also got in touch with some of the authors. So to build like a small network of thinkers and professionals who work with them. And some are from NGOs, some are activist groups, some are ethnomusicologists, some are anthropologists. So with this, I sort of like gathered all the references as well. And I guess the project became somewhat of a bibliography to start. That would eventually also include the communities themselves to help gather material that was representing them. So in a way, I wasn't interested in representing the communities myself. I was interested in sort of advancing this platform of representation for them as well, so they could represent themselves pretty much. So I was working with the communities directly. There are 18 communities within the Bataan Peninsula, and then I was talking to the chieftains and the elders and the representatives from all 18 communities. And then it was a series of long conversations and workshops wherein we made maps, and then I was also consulting with them some of the work that I was doing that was also relating to some of their local history, like the Japanese soldier on the lower left and the American soldier on the upper right, and then like a face of an Aita on the upper left with fish on its head. I guess like as an interesting anecdote would be like one of the common stories from the elders would be like the American soldiers would commission them to gather forest produce, and then after a long day of hard work, they would be paid with a can of sardines. And they wouldn't exactly know what this can of sardines would mean. It's like a job well done, or are they being exploited or what? So they would consume the sardines and they would get the sardine sauce and put it on their hair, and then that's what they use as a perfume to visit their in-laws and whatnot. So at the same time, they were also associating the smell of the sardines with that of having worked for the white man. So little stories like that, which also resonated into the work that I produced for the exhibition alongside the materials I had gathered. And then here are some of the material, details from the exhibition. So all the archival maps, archival photographs. Some sheet music also was contributed by ethnomusicologists who did field work and contributed field recordings to go with the exhibition and into the archive. And also within the exhibition were some public programs to gather people and also the communities to participate in discussing themes around representing indigeneity and how it all fits today, largely speaking. Sorry, I'm just grabbing. And then here are some images of the communities, or at least representatives of the communities. Because the thing is, like the exhibition was in Metro Manila, and then there's very little access to the communities themselves. And I guess like being within the exhibition and the contradiction of the exhibition to be quite like an elitist platform for different people. So eventually after the exhibition, we brought the exhibition to Bataan, back into Las Casas, but still Las Casas is a private resort wherein the community still don't have access to it. So as of now, the work is still parked there, and we're still thinking of ways on how to give it back to the community, because that's the idea, that the exhibition will be the initial content for the resource center and like a museum, which they can continue to gather more like material to represent themselves, and at the same time they can continue their own representation. So like on the upper left is a map, one of the many maps that they drew, and then like in the leftmost mountains like is the name Akuzar, and Akuzar is also the owner of the resort where the residency is. So I guess also to show a little bit of the contradiction which came out within the research and the exhibition, like they also have some land which is technically part of ancestral land. So yeah, like I said, like there's still, like it's still like a work in progress in the sense that I can't exactly wrap it up. It's still parked there in the space. And then the community that's supposed to take it is also like ran by a Korean priest that runs the community, whatever that means. So I guess like in the next couple of weeks, I'm gonna have to also go back there and sort of negotiate with them how we can further collaborate appropriately with not too much strings attached. Yeah. So yeah, that's my last slide, and I kind of want to wrap it up. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to like ask you all. I mean, we've been talking for today and the past couple of days also, and how you would want to sort of, how you see your own projects sort of continuing.
Well, wow, it's amazing, man. And I found a lot of intersection and feel connected with Cian's work, especially like in the first glimpse. I got the ethnographical color idea and way you are developing your works, but at the same time, you also give the subject. They are talking on behalf of themselves, and my question also to you was, how was the dynamic that was developing in the process of making your work? I mean, what was the discussion that is growing when you reveal the story of themselves?
Okay, maybe I can answer your question, and you can answer your own question also. Yeah, right. yeah. Because I can ask you that back again. Okay, I guess quickly to answer, like my artistic practice is also intertwined with my activist practice, and it's one and the same. A lot of my work has to do with organizing. But I'm not exactly an organizer. A lot of the things I do, I'm not exactly trained for. So it's all very DIY. I was trained as a painter. But then, yeah, I guess it sort of just is intertwined within grassroots activism and community-based work. So, for example, the maps that we make, it's an ongoing project of mine that's also in collaboration with some geographers and activists in Manila, where we sort of like try to do counter mapping workshops, in a sense that we sort of like we rethink the gesture of making maps as a political gesture into sort of representing your own space. So yeah, there's a lot of different sides into the activist practice that leads into the artistic practice.
So how will I develop and grow my project? Well, actually, it seems like it's fiction, but I have to tell that fiction in this context of my work, it's stand as an instrument. It's an instrument to talk about something that is considered non-existing or invisible. And the question is how you talk about something that is refused to be acknowledged that is happening. Like the story of the massacre, or also lots of story during the regime, and then how can we talk about this kind of stories when it's still being refused to be happen. So with this quote unquote the fictional institution, I'm using this as a signifier to talk about this invisible thing, and then it's growing as I collecting more stories, and it will be growing as I get some more oral history, because here I also work with a real historian, with a filmmaker, and also anthropologist. But then all of the data, we transform the data into something that could be experienced by the audience. that can give the audience space to reflect themselves in the stories. So that's why a fictional becomes the instrument, and yeah, it's growing as I collecting much more archive and stories. I think, yeah.
I have a question for both of you. That's correct.
Yeah.
So there's this, like how do you confront this by bringing anthropological and ethnographic registers into your work? There's this, how do you kind of confront the pitfalls and limitations of those two registers? Because both your projects are like in representation, so that the politics of that representation and the historical sort of baggage also comes with it.
Yeah. Well, the key point in this case for me is a reflexivity. So because in the history, colonial was the instruments to get lots of information of the locals and then to exploit them. It's the colonial instruments, but then as the knowledge is progressing also, and we know now this the reflexivity where we as a ethnographer or the researcher, we have to admit our baggage also, and also even our distances with this subject matter. So these legs we have to admit without, I think that's from me. Maybe you can.
Yeah. Same. Yeah, I mean, it's like if I start, you can just go on and on. But then, yeah, generally, I think I agree.
Thank you.
Okay, to be continued.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cian. Thank you,
Thank you.
Timoteus.